After Donald Trump came to power in the US, Putin seems to have a real chance to implement what Russian opposition political strategist Abbas Gallyamov predicted 3 years ago. Then, in his article, the expert suggested that if Putin fails to achieve his goals in Ukraine by military means, he could transform his image from a warrior to a wise old man. In a situation where almost all Russians are getting pretty fed up with the protracted war, Putin will suddenly come out and declare that the main goals of the special operation have been achieved, so it must be stopped. And Russians will thank God that they have such a wise president who figured out what's what and does not insist on continuing the slaughter that has lost all meaning. Several dozen people, of course, will have to be imprisoned, and 100 or 2 sent into retirement, but for a strong leader this will not be a problem, Gallyamov predicted. On February 25, 2025, the political strategist posted a link to this old article on his Telegram channel and wrote, "I especially recommend paying attention to the sad fate of the most active conductors of the previous course." The very next day, the expert commented on the news about the detention of the Vologda vice governor, noting that the most rabid hawks are beginning to go out of fashion with the corresponding consequences for themselves, and it seems that 1937 is returning to Russia. At the same time, in an interview with Vasily Golovanov for the YouTube channel Fabrika Novosti, Abbas Gallyamov emphasized that the entire world political system has now come into motion, so it is extremely difficult to predict anything. But be that as it may, Putin will still maneuver in a rapidly changing situation and do everything possible to ensure that all sorts of zogi do not think that the president has completely screwed up the situation. The leader of the Russian Federation will try to look like a person who is guarding the interests of the motherland. Thus, even in conditions when it is difficult to predict anything, Gallyamov made it clear that the scenario of Putin turning into a wise old man is quite probable. Incidentally, this is also evidenced by the recent statement of the Russian leader that the war in Ukraine began because it was the will of the Lord. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte spoke with Donald Trump, President of the United States. The President and Secretary General discussed the critical need for a settlement on Ukraine to be enduring. They recognized the valiant Ukrainian defense since the full-scale invasion in 2022, which was enabled by the assistance of America and its allies, starting with the Javelin anti-tank missiles provided in the first Trump administration. Great to talk with Donald Trump. US and NATO are getting stronger. NATO allies are moving quickly to invest more in defense. Big increases announced and others to follow, Rutte said on X. On Ukraine, allies are preparing billions more in aid and contributions to security guarantees, he added. Recall, NATO allies spent more than €50 billion on military support to Ukraine in 2024, according to internal data shared with Euractiv, but the impact on the battlefield is still difficult to determine. The figure means NATO members have exceeded their initial target of sending €40 billion worth of military support to Ukraine. The €40 billion target was meant to match the amounts the alliance had spent in previous years since the war in Ukraine started in February 2022. Last year saw Ukraine take delivery of US-made fighter jets, Patriot air defense systems, and other high-end capabilities. However, it is unclear into which capabilities NATO's €50 billion spending figure can be translated, or how much impact it can have in giving Ukraine an advantage on the battlefield. As Europeans are repeating public statements that promise increased defense spending, NATO is also expected to announce Europe handled 60% of total military aid deliveries to Ukraine last year, with the other 40% carried out by the US, according to the data shared with Euractiv. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday hailed the start of a renewed dialogue with the US, saying that the administration of President Donald Trump showed a pragmatism, a realistic view, and noting that it had abandoned the stereotypes and messianic ideological cliches of its predecessors. The first contacts with the new US administration encouraged certain hopes, Putin said at a meeting with top officials of the Federal Security Service, Russia's top domestic security agency. There is a mutual readiness to work to restore relations and gradually solve a colossal amount of systemic strategic problems in the global architecture, he said. According to Associated Press, he hailed the Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, saying that their courage and resilience had created the conditions for the beginning of talks on a peaceful settlement. He added that the resumption of US-Russian contacts vexed many in Europe and emphasized that Russian diplomats and security agencies should focus their efforts on resisting attempts to derail US-Russian talks.
Первые контакты с новой американской администрацией вселяют определенные надежды. Есть встречный настрой работать на восстановление межгосударственных отношений. Но постепенное решение колоссального объема накопившихся системных стратегических проблем в мировой архитектуре. А именно эти проблемы в свое время спровоцировали и украинские, и другие региональные кризисы. Важно, что наши сегодняшние партнеры демонстрируют прагматизм, реальный взгляд на вещи. Отказываются от многих стереотипов, так называемых правил и мессианских идеологических клише своих предшественников, которые, собственно, и привели к кризису всей системы международных отношений. Сегодняшние динамичные изменения в международном ландшафте – это в огромной степени результат мужества и стойкости наших вооруженных сил, наших героев. Именно они своей доблестью, своими ежедневными победами создали условия для начала серьезного диалога. Понимаем, что не всех устраивает возобновление российско-американских контактов. Часть западных элит по-прежнему настроена на сохранение нестабильности в мире. И эти силы будут пытаться сорвать или скомпрометировать начавшийся диалог. Мы это с вами видим. Нам нужно это учитывать и использовать все возможности дипломатии и специальных служб для срыва подобных попыток.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries vows Democrats will fight to protect the American people against the budget plan being pushed forward by Republicans. According to Associated Press, President Donald Trump wants the Republicans who control Congress to approve a massive bill that would extend tax breaks, which he secured during his first term but are expiring later this year, while also cutting spending across federal programs and services. House Republicans passed an ambitious budget blueprint for Trump's agenda earlier in the week. Congress has to turn the plans for $4.5 trillion in tax cuts and $2 trillion in slashed spending into a bill that can be passed by the House and Senate. Republicans say if they fail to act, the lower tax rates first approved in 2017 will expire, which would amount to a massive tax hike for many Americans. They believe keeping the tax cuts in place will partly pay for themselves, unleashing economic growth and fresh revenues, though others say those projections are optimistic. Democrats put up stiff opposition against the House GOP plan. One lawmaker dashed from California after a week's stay in the hospital and another returned to Washington for the vote with her newborn son. Democrats will spend the weeks ahead warning Americans what's at stake. Without steep cuts to federal programs, Republicans won't be able to claim the savings they need to offset the costs of the tax breaks. And without offsetting the costs, conservative GOP lawmakers won't want to vote for the final package.
Good morning, everyone. Earlier this week, House Democrats stood on the side of the American people. Every single member of the House Democratic Caucus stood on the side of the American people in opposing the reckless Republican budget scheme. The Republican budget will set in motion the largest cut to Medicaid in American history.